بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل لا أملك لنفسي نفعا ولا ضرا إلا ما شاء الله ولو كنت أعلم الغيب لاستكثرت من الخير وما مسني السوء إن أنا إلا نذير وبشير لقوم يؤمنون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Constructive criticism is a critical element in the path towards success. And the idea is that in constructive criticism, as opposed to regular criticism, the criticism is focused on a person's performance, his deeds, rather than his personality. So no offense is meant to be taken. Any personal issues are placed aside, and the criticism focuses on the person's ability to perform. In some companies, the management offers reports for its employees, and the idea behind these reports is to criticize their performance, to let them know in what areas they can excel and what areas they're doing well in. After a person is criticized, he has a set of values, and those values direct his path to success. And the idea is that constructive criticism comes from a person who has experience himself in order to offer that criticism. The Quran tells us to travel in order to see the way people live. And once a person sees the way people live and what mistakes they made, then he can create a proper path to success. قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانْظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ. See what the consequences of the people that before you were. And the whole idea is that you see the mistakes of people who came before you so you can build a proper path in front of you. Now, the best sort of constructive criticism is the kind that comes from a person who is objective and unbiased. The less biased a person is, or the less biased he is, or the more objective that person is, the more value that criticism has. And this is why the companions of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, they were the luckiest people because they had direct access to people who were not biased, people who were objective. If you look at the way of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt and the Prophet, is that whenever they offered criticism, they never targeted a person for who he is, but they would criticize their deeds. Why? In order to correct their path. And this element, which is in the Quran, it's a recurring element that the Prophet, like other prophets, but especially our Prophet, is a guide and a warner. Nadhirun wa bashir. A warner and a guide. God constantly reminds the Prophet in the Quran that you have no control over these people. You're only a guide. Lasta alayhim bimusaytir. You don't have control. You can't force them to do good. You can guide them. You can critique them. But they have to build that path to success, that path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by themselves. So the best kind of criticism is taken from people who are not biased and people who are objective. And that's how we should build our lives. That's how we should build our path to success. It's based on the advice of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. Because nobody could become successful if they're not criticized at one point and another in their life or in their career. Ask people. Ask people in the fields of education and science and medicine and business. What they'll tell you is that we always had people criticize us constructively in order to build us. Criticize our performance. Nobody could start a path and say, you know what, I'm going to take this road, I'm going to start business, or I'm going to start law or medicine or my education or whatever, and I don't want anybody to criticize me. That person's going to fail. You can't go at anything alone in this life. And when it comes to criticism, we look at the advice of the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, because they offer the best constructive criticism. Their words have value because they were people who not only had experience in themselves, but they were divinely inspired by Allah. Their guidance and their criticism came directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You look at the words of Imam Ali alayhi salam. In one of his hadith, he divides people into three groups. He says, "An-nasu thalatha." People are three groups. The first, he refers to as alimun rabbani, a learned person, a learned scholar. The second is muta'allimun ala sabil al-najat, a student or person who is on the path of knowledge towards salvation, ala sabil al-najat. And everybody else who does not fall under these first two categories, he refers to as hamajun wa ru'a, savages. So it's either a knowledgeable person or a student on the path to knowledge, or you're a savage. You're an animal. Or he compares you to an animal, because what's the difference between man and animal? An animal can sleep, it can eat, it can recognize its surroundings, it can interact, it can reproduce and mate. Well, a human being can do those, but a human being can also understand, can learn, can develop spiritually. So if you're not on the path of spiritual development, and the best way to do that is through knowledge, then you are compared to a savage, you're compared to an animal. And the reason he says مُتَعَلِّمٌ عَلَى سَبِيلِ النَّجَاةِ, a student on the path to salvation, is because in the school of Ahlul Bayt, the school of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt, knowledge is salvation. And ignorance is destruction. If you are not on the path of knowledge, you are on the path of destruction. If you are ignorant, you are on the path of self-destruction. Now, when it comes to contemporary values, a phrase which is said by everyone, young and old, sometimes educated and non-educated, a really popular saying is ignorance is bliss, right? They say that ignorance is bliss. What you don't know can't hurt you. There's many reasons why they say ignorance is bliss. You notice the most convenient excuse? What's the most convenient excuse for anyone? I don't know. That's the most convenient excuse. Especially when a person gets caught red-handed. If the police officer pulls you over for crossing a red light or making an illegal turn or something, officer, I don't know. That's the first answer that you've prepared, right? I didn't know, I couldn't do that. Or if your teacher catches you doing something you're not supposed to do in school, oh, well, can you let me off? I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that, right? I don't know is the most convenient excuse. Anybody can say it, I don't know. Because the point behind it is that, let me off, I don't know, and you can't hold me accountable to that which I don't know. Which is true to a certain extent. You can never hold a person accountable for something that they don't know. And so everyone takes this convenient excuse, and whenever they don't want to face responsibility, when they want to bypass the stage of accountability, they say, I don't know, right? It's very convenient to say, I don't know. I didn't know I couldn't do that. Or I didn't know I was supposed to do this. Everyone, young and old, we don't know. Now, when we look at ignorance, to a certain extent, ignorance is bliss. Although in the school of Ahlul Bayt, ignorance is associated with destruction and with savagery, hamajun wa ru'a, savage people, hamaj. Although to a certain extent, ignorance can be bliss. There are different types of ignorance. In logic, in Islamic logic, they mention different types of ignorance. One is simple ignorance. This is one division for ignorance. Simple ignorance and complex ignorance. Jahl basit wa jahl murakkab. And what's the difference between the two? Simple ignorance is when a person is ignorant of a fact. Complex ignorance is when a person thinks he knows, but he is ignorant. Why do they call it complex? Because in the second one, you are ignorant of something and you are ignorant of your own ignorance. And that's why they call it complex. I'll give you an example. If somebody asks me right now, what's the distance between the earth and the sun? And I say, I don't know. I'm ignorant. That's simple ignorance. But if a person asks me, what's the difference between the earth and the sun? And I say 500 million miles. And I'm wrong. It's not 500 million miles. This is complex ignorance. Because I'm ignorant, I don't know what the truth is, and I'm ignorant of my own ignorance. So see, there's simple ignorance and there's complex ignorance. And there's a difference between the two. There's another division for ignorance as well. There's short-handed ignorance, which is caused by a person himself, and ignorance which is caused by the situation a person is placed in, right? Short-handed ignorance is when a person does not have access to information. You don't have access to information. Someone's stuck in a village somewhere, in a country where there's no internet, there's no TV, there's no books. That's short-handed ignorance. And in Islamic law, in judicial terms, that person is referred to as qasir, when he's short-handedly ignorant. He doesn't have access to knowledge or information. Whereas a person who is muqassir is also short-handed, but his ignorance is a consequence of his own deeds. Imagine a person right now is sick and he wants to heal himself through taking medicine. Imagine there's medicine on top of the table, okay? But he's a midget, he's too short. He can't get to it. And he has no access to it. Okay, no one can come and help him, all right? And he has completely no access. It's there, but he has no access to it. If he falls sick, or if he dies from that sickness, nobody's going to blame him. Why? Because he had no access to that medicine. Whereas if a person places the medicine on top of the table, and he knows once he's sick, he's not going to have access to it. Or if he places it somewhere where he knows later on when he's sick, he's not going to have access to it, then what happens? He's placed himself in that situation. So if he gets sick or if he dies out of that sickness, you can tell him, well, you had access to that medicine, but you placed yourself in that situation. Both people are short-handed, but you can blame one and you can't blame the other. And when it comes to ignorance, what type of ignorance is bliss? The only type of ignorance which is bliss is the kind where you have no control over. You have absolutely no control over. And this is what the Quran tells us. Sometimes we're placed in situations where we have no access to information. ربنا لا تجعل علينا إصرا لا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به. O Lord, do not place upon us a burden which we cannot overcome. And when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to ignorance, we are only held accountable to that which we have access to. So a person who does not have access to information, that may be bliss, but a person who does have access to information and is still ignorant, that's the kind of ignorance which, in the words of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, is equated with is associated with your destruction, is associated with corruption. When you can be knowledgeable, but you choose not to be. And today, the case can be made that there is no excuse to be ignorant, especially for a person living in the West. Knowledge is at your fingertips. Each one of us, we have these devices. We have one at home, and we have one in our pocket, and it's on TV, and it's on our laptops, and everywhere we go, there's information. But unfortunately, and this is something that we should all heed, whether we're old or young. See, the way technology has been introduced into our lives, whenever you purchase technology, there's no moral code that you have to subscribe to. You know, when you purchase a laptop or an iPad, they don't tell you in the store, okay, well, before we sell this to you, here, sign a contract that you're going to use this legally and properly. You're only going to go on news sites which have been verified. You're only going to listen to news which has been verified. So nobody tells you that. Once you buy it, you can do whatever you want with it. So there's no moral code. We're not bound by any moral code. The problem with technology today is that it has placed the true sources of knowledge aside. And a lot of our information these days comes from technology. You see a picture, I've seen this, you see a picture, and they say, oh, look at the Shia, they do this. Or, oh, look at the Sunnis, they do this. Look at the Jews, they do this. And they get some random picture out of nowhere, and all of a sudden you associate that with that school of thought or that faith or that idea. Unfortunately, technology has made us lazy. We don't go and say, okay, well, what is the true, what are the facts? We depend on technology. So it has a good side and it has a bad side. The good side is that the knowledge is all there, available at your fingertips. The negative side, the bad side, is that it has made us very lazy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of knowledge in the Quran. When He speaks about the Prophet, He tells him, say, O Prophet, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, قل لا أملك لنفسي نفعا ولا ضرا إلا ما شاء الله ولو كنت أعلم الغيب لاستكثرت من الخير وما مسني السوء. He says, tell them, O Prophet, that I hold no benefit for myself, and if I had knowledge of the unseen, then I would benefit myself. The claim is this, is that a group of people came to the Prophet, mocking him. They said that if you were truly a prophet, you would have knowledge of the unseen. You wouldn't be ignorant of the unseen. And if you had knowledge of the unseen, you'd be able to use that to your advantage, right? Financial advantage. Imagine if a stockbroker on Wall Street in New York had knowledge of the unseen. He knows exactly what's going to happen in the future. What stocks are going to rise, what stocks are going to fall. He could use that to his advantage, correct? He could buy cheap stocks today, which are going to rise in value tomorrow. And he could use that towards his advantage. That's the claim that the people had towards the Prophet, is that if you have knowledge of the future, well, you know that, for instance, in 5 years, there's going to be a drought. So stock up on food items right now. Use it towards your benefit. Because you don't have knowledge, that means that you're not a prophet. God, this is what He tells the Prophet. He says, say to them, these people, that I have no knowledge illa ma sha Allah. That what God gives to me as knowledge of the unseen. And if I did have knowledge of the unseen, of the future, that I would be able to attract benefit, specifically financial benefit towards me. Now here's the question. Does the Prophet have knowledge of the unseen or not? How is the Prophet able to prophesize what would happen in the future? Many of the hadith of the Prophet, of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, they tell us what will happen in the future. Even today, in what's going on today in the Middle East, our scholars refer to the authentic sources, authentic ahadith of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, which outline what happens in the Middle East, in Sham, for instance, and in Iraq, and in Mecca, and so on. These are taken from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. How are they able to do that if they don't have access to the knowledge of the unseen? قل لا أملك لنفسي نفعا ولا ضرا إلا ما شاء الله ولو كنت أعلم الغيب. If I had knowledge of the unseen, then I would do this and that. So what's the ayah implying, the verse? That the Prophet does not have knowledge of the unseen. Now when you look at the traditions of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, you find that many of them express that the Prophet and the Imams actually do have knowledge of the unseen, and they're not ignorant. There's a hadith that says that they have the knowledge of ما كان وما يكون وما هو كائن إلى يوم القيامة. The knowledge of what is, what shall be, and what was, until the day of judgment. And then at the same time, there are ahadith which state that the Imams had no knowledge of the unseen. For example, there's a hadith where the 11th Imam, Al-Imam Al-Hasan Al-Askari, he had a servant in his home and his servant ran away. He left. So they came to the Imam. The first thing that they did was they came to the Imam and they asked him, well, do you know of the whereabouts of this servant? He says, I have no idea where he is. But then we have other ahadith which say that the Imams do have knowledge of the unseen, and the Prophet, of course. For instance, there's a hadith where one time Al-Ma'mun Al-Abbasi, the Khalifa, he gives a gift to the 8th Imam, Al-Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Rada. He gives a gift to, Ali ibn Yaqtin, who was a companion of the 8th Imam, Al-Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Rada. He was a minister in the government of Al-Ma'mun, but he was also a very close companion of the 8th Imam. So he had heard, the Khalifa had heard that this man, Ali ibn Yaqtin, was very close to the Imam and he was a loyalist. So he was afraid, he didn't want him to switch loyalties, not knowing that Ali ibn Yaqtin was a very loyal companion of the 8th Imam. So he gives him a gift. He gives him money and he gives him robes, brand new robes, clothes. And he sends him off. What he does is he sends 2 spies with him. So the first thing that this man does, Ali ibn Yaqtin, is he goes to the home of the 8th Imam, Al-Imam al-Rada, and he offers him the gift. He offers him the gift. So the Imam, he takes the money from him and he gives him back the robes. So Ali ibn Yaqtin, he says, why don't you take the whole gift? He says, you're going to need these robes. I'll take the money, but take these robes back. What he didn't know is that Al-Ma'mun had sent 2 spies with him. So when Al-Ma'mun finds out about this, he summons him. He tells him, come here. He comes to him. He says, either you give me back the robes and the money that I gave you, because I found out that you took it to Ali ibn Musa al-Rada, or it's off with your head. So what happens? He goes back home, he sends the soldiers with him, and the robes, which the Imam refused to take, he takes back to the Khalifa, and the money is just money, it's printed money. He takes some of his own money and he takes it back to the Khalifa. Now someone can suggest that the Imam did have knowledge of the unseen and he was able to save him. He was able to save the life of his companion. Whereas the other ahadith state that no, the Imams do not have knowledge of the unseen. So how do we solve this conflict? These issues are all based on personal conviction. Believing or not believing that they were knowledgeable of the unseen or they were ignorant of the unseen, that does not make you a Muslim or not make you a Muslim, or make you a follower of Ahlul Bayt or not make you a follower of Ahlul Bayt. These are things which are based on personal conviction. Now, whether or not the Prophet had knowledge of the unseen, there's a more practical point behind this verse. Is that the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt have knowledge of the unseen only when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants them the right to do so. One man comes to Imam Ali alayhi salam and he tells them that you have the knowledge of the unseen. He says, we know everything except one thing, and that is when the day of judgment will occur. That's the only thing that the Imams... So see, there are ahadith on different sides. But what we know for a fact is that the knowledge of the Imams comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When He chooses to show them, He shows them. And when He chooses to hide from them, like in the case with the Day of Judgment, He does so. The whole point is, when you look at the verse, What does the Prophet say? لا أملك لنفسي نفعا ولا ضرا إلا ما شاء الله ولو كنت أعلم الغيب. If I had knowledge of the unseen. Which in this case, Allah had not granted him the knowledge of the unseen, and He had told him to tell the polytheists that I only know that which God gives me. The whole point is there's practicality behind every verse in the Quran. Is that when it comes to saying I don't know, it's fine. If a person is not knowledgeable and he's asked a question, you don't have to pretend and act like you know a question, the answer to a question. It's okay to say I don't know. However, that can't be an excuse for continued ignorance. That's the whole point. The hadith says that if you are asked a question and you don't know the answer, it's better to say I don't know than to provide an answer which is wrong. It says he who does so, فَلْيَتَبَوَّأْ مَقْعَدَهُ مِنَ النَّارِ. Let him reserve his seat. You know when you buy a ticket online and you go and you reserve your seat exactly where you want a seat, or a window seat or an aisle or in the middle. The hadith says reserve your seat in the hellfire for a person who gives an answer which is wrong based on his own ignorance. So you're safer to say I don't know than to give an answer which may or may not be wrong. فَلْيَتَبَوَّعْ مَقْعَدَهُ مِنَ النَّارِ. However, that can never be an excuse for continued ignorance. Look at the example of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. The Imams of Ahlul Bayt, as soon as the opportunity presented itself to them, they began expending their knowledge. Now, one can argue that during the time of Al-Imam al-Hasan, Al-Imam al-Hussein, the opportunity didn't present itself because they lived under Banu Umayyah and they lived under restrictions. And then Al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin also lived in Medina and there were many restrictions on him. But as soon as it came to the fifth Imam, the fifth and sixth Imams, that was their job. And this is why the fifth Imam, his attribute, his name is Al-Baqir. Al-Baqir means the one who tears through or the one who cuts through. And the idea is that he tore through the knowledge of the Prophet, which had stayed dormant for so many years. The Imams of Ahlul Bayt, which came before him, they weren't even allowed to speak. They weren't allowed to dispel the ahadith of Rasulullah. Read about this history. What happened? One of the things that happened after the death of the Prophet is that the faculty of knowledge, all the knowledge that the Prophet had passed on to his companions and his family members, was taken and it was destroyed. The hadith mentioned that some of the companions, they took their own ahadith, and imagine, this is something that they heard straight from Rasulullah. And what comes from Rasulullah comes from Allah. They would take their hadith and they would place them in big piles and they would burn them. They would burn them, the hadith that they heard from Rasulullah. Why? That tells you that Rasulullah had something to say which for whatever reason, mainly political reasons, they did not want other people to hear. They did not want people to hear. That knowledge which stayed dormant for such a long time, and there were people who were punished for narrating the hadith of Rasulullah. Punished for narrating it, yes. But then the opportunity presented itself for the fifth and sixth Imam, so they established schools. And look at what our sixth Imam established. Thousands of students. Tens of thousands of students. Which he taught. Even when you look at the other schools of thought, the four other main schools of thought, Hanbali, Hanafi, Shafi'i and Maliki, all of those go back to our sixth Imam, Al-Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. Our sixth Imam was the teacher of these four schools of thought. All of them go back to him. Abu Hanifa was his student, and then the rest of the three were all students, one after another, of Abu Hanifa and of each other. This all comes back to our sixth Imam. So saying I don't know And although ignorance sometimes may be bliss, but it's only bliss for a short while. It's a blessing for a short while, right? When the cop pulls you over, going back to this example, when the cop pulls you over on the street and you say, "Officer, I didn't know that I couldn't exceed the speed limit, or I didn't know that I couldn't make this right turn or this left turn," he'll probably let you go the first time, maybe the second time, but the third time he's going to give you a ticket. He said, you may have been ignorant the first or second times, but that's not an excuse to say ignorant, to stay ignorant. So ignorance is bliss to a certain extent, but not always. And that's why the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, they would not only preach knowledge, but they built generations of knowledgeable people. And if you ask any knowledgeable person right now, they'll tell you that whatever knowledge you seek, if you are on the path to knowledge, it requires all of your energy. And they would expend all of their time with the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. You find a person like Humran ibn A'yun, one of the companions of our sixth Imam. He was so knowledgeable that one day a man came to debate him. He came to debate the sixth Imam. And many people, they would come to him because he had established this institution. They would want to debate him, especially matters concerning the existence of Allah. He turns to this man, he points to his companion, Humran. He says, if you are able to defeat him in a debate, then you have defeated me. The Imam says this. These are the kind of people that they would raise, people who constantly sought knowledge and through everything that they had, gave all of their energy to knowledge. And that's why the saying is, لا يعطيك العلم بعضه حتى تعطيه كلك. That knowledge, once you give all of your energy, you dedicate all of your time, everything that you have to knowledge, in return, it's not going to give you anything. It's only going to give you a portion. If you want just a portion of knowledge, you're going to have to give everything. So what if a person wants all of knowledge? It's possible. It's very possible. If the companions of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam were able to do so, some of them didn't even have access to the Imam. Some people built their knowledge and they didn't have access. All they had was ahadith which were written on paper and given to them. So if a person lives in an age where technology gives him the opportunity to seek knowledge, there's no excuse. That excuse that I don't know, or I didn't know that I couldn't do that, or I didn't know that I couldn't do this, that mentality may have existed before, but now we live in a generation, or we live in a time where that doesn't exist anymore. So the message is this: to take the month of Ramadan as an opportunity to seek more knowledge. Anything which you do in this month, anything which is mustahab in itself, its value is multiplied in this month. Dedicate some time to knowledge. Read one or two of the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt daily. Or try to memorize one daily. And look at how it will affect the way you begin to think. Because the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, one of the ahadith, and I leave you with this, the Imam tells his companions, أنتم أفقه الناس إذا عرفتم معاني أحاديثنا. He says, if you contemplated on the meanings of our hadith, what we had to say, you'll be the most knowledgeable people. Because all of the secrets of the universe, the secrets of Islam, are not written in the hadith of Ibn Fulan and Abu Fulan. They're taken from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, and their knowledge is taken directly from the Prophet, and that is taken directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this month to open up our hearts and minds to the words of the Quran and the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to not allow us to be ignorant, to open up our hearts to knowledge. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك قاضي الحاجات إنك على كل شيء قدير برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآله